Thank you. That was an awesome introduction. I'm actually really excited to be here today for many different reasons, but maybe especially because like my two favorite writers are from Vancouver. I came here 12 years ago when I was working on the design of the Seattle Library, and I just really wanted to see the city that had spawned, or at least become the home of both William Gibson and Douglas Coupland. I drove up from Seattle and driving over Granville Bridge, I was like mesmerized by this sort of like amazing skyline of these glass towers, like sparkling new and shining. The city looked almost like a rendering, like almost too perfect. And my fascination, and I really came to see what kind of city had actually become the home of these two people that has so much inspired me in my early life. I discovered William Gibson when I was 19. I came across Neuromancer and Count Zero and Mona Lisa Overdrive, discovering the Matrix. He actually invented the Matrix and the whole idea of cyberspace, like sitting on a typewriter. Which I think is like it's like an inspiration for all. But I think what I really noticed was his capacity to extrapolate from the present a very likely future. Essentially, this idea that in our sort of current technological possibilities or social behavior actually lies the propensity of where we're going in the future. Essentially, what we're doing now will define our future. The things we surround us with will actually form our future. And that was like really an inspiring thing to really realize that what we do right now is actually going to be what we are going to be suffering in the future. And then when I started studying architecture, I came across Douglas Coupland. I came across Generation X, and like first of all, I was very happy that Douglas Coupland described himself as the child of the middle class. Because like I come from a pretty well-functioning home in the north of Copenhagen, and when you're going to the art academy, you really want to have some kind of traumatic background that you can feed from. But so Douglas Coupland did it, and I think one of his amazing capabilities is that he has this capacity to see in the sort of in the everyday, the meaningful, that essentially the mundane has the possibility of the divine, or the sort of the mediocre has the possibility for the meaningful. Almost like Andy Warhol, Douglas Coupland has the capacity to sort of expand our perception of the world, to make us realize the sort of the meaning and the sense and the beauty in things that we would normally like miss or dismiss as sort of a noise or static, and I think that really sort of gives us this sort of realization also in architecture that we don't have to look to astrology or like complicated French philosophy or whatever architects sort of have to find in order to like complicate things, because like life is already super interesting, and like even in the sort of practicalities of everyday life is actually all of the potential to create something meaningful and something poetic. So today I'm actually I'm really excited that I together with Ian and Jim and Bruce from Dialogue, we're probably going to get the chance to contribute to the city, to the architecture of the city, whose citizens, if you like, have actually contributed massively to our or my approach to architecture. So I'd like to start with just like Ian had actually asked me to spend no time on the Vancouver project, because like it was important that this evening is not about sort of propaganda about this project, but still, like now that I have 1,300 Vancouverans, I really want to explain what we did. Sorry, Ian. So basically, actually, the site that Jim and Ian suggested we take a look at is right where Granville Bridge reaches downtown. It's part of one of a handful of sites that the city has identified as areas where you can actually maybe build even denser than you normally do, specifically because it's going to form this gateway. As you can see, the site is sort of shredded by the forking of the lanes of the bridge. It dodges the view cones that the city has identified to ensure the views of the city. And that's why this really has the potential to do something that can continue this project that is Vancouver Ism, namely to make a very dense and residential downtown in the middle of this incredible landscape. This sort of notion of living in this sort of incredible nature is sort of started already by Erickson in the 50s. We looked at this little timeline of the evolution of Vancouverism until the coining of the term in 2005 and the Vancouverism exhibition in 2008. And essentially it's sort of made Vancouver world famous for really showing how you can actually have both a really livable and an enjoyable city with abundance of nature, a walkable sort of almost European city environment, and at the same time the sort of the towers that you know from the American and Asian cities. And the main sort of ingredient of Vancouverism, Bruce said it brilliantly yesterday, that maybe the one criticism you can come to Vancouver with is that as an architectural typology, Vancouver has been relentlessly consistent. That it's the tower podium. And we thought, having had the sort of the opportunity to work in various places, one of the things that drive us is our possibility to go in and actually acquire a lot of local knowledge. So essentially we thought it could be interesting to continue this evolution, and obviously the tower podium has turned into like the skinny tower with townhouses surrounding the base, or even mixed-use programs. And we thought maybe we could take this sort of typology one step further. Back to the site. Obviously, the site is quite complex. It's sort of the city has initiated this plan of making a new gateway. So essentially, framing the bridge with two towers, one of them on this property. Also, what really drives the enjoyment of living in Vancouver is that you're surrounded with this sort of incredible nature and incredible views. So essentially, the higher you get into the building, the nicer it is to be there. And also, right next to the site is the main Lawn Brown Park, where we wanted to make sure that we wouldn't cast shadows after the early morning, to ensure that it remains a nice place to be in the advent that the sun would shine. I mean, I'm from Copenhagen. We have the exact same weather. So this is basically the situation. As you can see, the site is really tormented by the arrival of the bridge, shredding it to pieces. So we basically just sat down and started mapping all of the constraints. There were some setback requirements from the sidewalk, some setback requirements preserving the structural autonomy of the bridge. Then there was almost like a deal breaker. There's a 100-foot setback because the city wants to ensure that nobody looks straight out at the traffic. And finally, to not cast any shadows on the park, we're left with a tiny triangular footprint, smaller than 6,000 square feet, almost undevelopable. But then we were thinking, if the 100-foot setback has to do with ensuring a minimum distance to the traffic, once we get sort of 100 feet in the air and clear the bridge, we can actually come back out and maximize the amount of the nicest apartments. So essentially, being like too small at the bottom, we can actually sort of reclaim some of that and put a lot of nice apartments at the top. So essentially, as you drive over Granville Bridge, it'll be almost like somebody is pulling a curtain aside, sort of welcome to Vancouver, this sort of gentle silhouette that opens up as you dynamically pass the building. Also within this like very simple geometry, as light passes over the building and as you approach it from different sides, this sort of game of light and shadow is going to animate the facade and make it transform during the day and as you move around the city. And of course, so you really see how it almost grows out of this incredibly complex urban situation. And when you see it on the skyline of Vancouver, it's really like one of the boys. It just has this like incredibly feminine silhouette to it. Structurally, of course, like when you're doing a building that's twice as big at the top as it is at the bottom, in a major seismic zone, you have to find some good engineers. But essentially, because the sort of expansion is so gradual, it's like the principle is really that we just simply walk the column on each floor. It moves a foot, and in that sense, we get all the way to the top. So as you move up through the building, you basically sort of complete the rectangle, and you have this like rather unusual shape created in a very, very straightforward and simple way. The texture on the facade is the balconies facing east and west, and they basically also help in a very passive way the environmental performance of the building, creating natural shade, so that as you can see this diagram to the right, in the summer when having like big beautiful windows to allow you to enjoy the view would cause you to fry in the sun. You have the natural shade, and in the winter when you really want the sun to help heat your building, you'll get the daylight in, like this very simple principle that we've applied on both sides. And as for the facades, we're looking at various options. Obviously this project is in a very early stage, but one of the ideas that we've been tossing around is maybe to work with a local British Columbia material, zinc, on the facade, but then almost like a liner in the sort of three-dimensionality of the balconies to work with this golden stainless steel material that would actually sort of, in a way, reveal the texture of the building and have this sort of warm liner within an otherwise like very simple sculptural silhouette. And leaving the city, you have this almost like genie in the bottle, a building appearing out of nothing. The building also really reminded us of the Flatiron, in the sense that the Flatiron is a product of a moment in New York's history of urban development, where the development in real estate value, the advent of the elevator and steel construction suddenly made this tiny triangular site that had been left undeveloped into a really, really interesting and very striking new architecture. And in many ways, the project on House Street has very similar attributes, except that it sort of bulges out at the top. But I think what's really striking with Flatiron is that the constraints that really shaped the building has made it one of the most recognized landmarks in New York, and it's really like the name of the whole neighborhood is now called the Flatiron District. And I think in many ways, the forces surrounding this particular site has really helped design this building into the proposal we're presenting now. So that's like, of course, one part of it and a very visible part of it. But at the base is maybe the sort of the more sort of in terms of urbanism, sort of proactive part of the project. That essentially you can say like these moments of infrastructure, the underside of the bridges is normally like a space that becomes almost like a black hole in the city fabric. And what we're trying to see is if we can actually turn this into a sort of new and exciting urban typology. So what we're proposing is what we've called sort of the urban village, to sort of break the volume down into a series of smaller buildings with like pedestrian spaces crisscrossing and little plazas sort of inhabiting the space between the bridge. The roofs are tilted and green, so that when you drive across the bridge, you'll sort of enjoy this green landscape from the bridge itself. Here you see the traffic sort of flowing between the buildings, leaving and entering the city. And it's like you can really see the life that sort of occurs between these buildings that pop up between the bridges and one of these courtyards, so that we imagine to bring a light and air deep into the lots. And again, like the flow of the traffic around really sort of shapes and carves these building volumes to get the quality they have. And this is essentially the idea that, as we saw this morning, having a canopy overhead can actually be a very good thing in Vancouver. So what we imagine is that in a way to reclaim and populate the space beneath the bridge, and to see it as the potential for like a whole body of interesting sort of urban possibilities. You can imagine that during the day, to maintain the liveliness of the shops and the restaurants, to have parking, and then sort of in the evening or like on special events, restaurants could spill out, or different events could actually occupy the space under the bridge. And working with West Bank and the city, we sort of came up with a whole sort of range of ideas that you can imagine would be able to occupy the space under the bridges. The Copenhagen Fashion Week normally puts a catwalk down through the city. It could easily happen here. The sort of to exploit the fact that you have a space overhead, you could have like these three-dimensional performance, or even like a permanent climbing wall. So like various ideas that we sort of introduced to try to see how you could occupy the space. The High Line in New York City has a series of things happening under it, including this incredibly popular beer garden. So like in a way, this sort of the unanticipated side effect of the infrastructure could actually suddenly trigger the sort of whole body of interesting things, a market, like various like fun activities, even like the community dinner for the neighborhood could happen there as this extremely long dining table. Various festivals. There's going to be like 150 of these slides. No, and even of course, like the underside, you can imagine like, so in this case, like this idea of like spilling out for like a festival, like the sort of the outdoor cinema, and even the fact that you can drive there could be some excuse to pull out your like 1960s Chevy. Also like, and of course again, the project is in the early stages. We're looking at not only locally, but also in collaboration with the surrounding community to try to exploit as many possibilities for synergy that we can in terms of the environmental performance of the development. And also we're looking at various like essentially off-the-shelf technologies that are quite common in Europe in terms of like reclaiming or like reharvesting the heat from the ventilation air, or various ideas of having thermoactive slabs to maintain a more stable temperature inside the buildings in a very sort of cost-effective way. So all this is being processed right now, but I think one of the main reasons that makes a building like this also sustainable is that this whole urban experiment that is Vancouver Ism, to see how densely can we actually inhabit so we don't have to drive. You know, it's much more energy efficient to take the elevator than to drive around. As a result, New York State, an average citizen of New York State spends a quarter of the energy that the average citizen of Texas, simply because of the density. So if you want to continue this development, eventually downtown is going to run out of space, but you have all these areas that are like in a way dominated by the infrastructure. And you know, of course, the whole notion of creating celebrating the arrival to the city across the bridge, but especially this idea of turning a potential for social life out of what could be deemed as a problem, the infrastructure. And then of course the fact that the site is really outside the view cone, so if you really want to densify, this is where you can do it. So I think in many ways there's like an incredible opportunity to add this new silhouette to this sort of quite striking skyline of Vancouver. And just, I mean, we've done it like, also like at some point, things also become about proportions. We did various studies of different heights, sort of looking at what the building would look like. And essentially it's almost like this process of deflating the building. And I think in many ways, our feeling was that this really has the potential to be a very sort of significant and elegant presence on the skyline of Vancouver. Not only as a sort of dynamic sculpture that you sort of move around, but also like all of the spaces that occur beneath could be a quite striking new contribution to the public realm of Vancouver. So it's a long process, but we had a really exciting design panel yesterday with people from Vancouver and some outside invited experts, and we have like some really interesting feedback. So I'm quite optimistic. One of the reasons that this project has really resonated with us is that one of our latest sort of discoveries is that seems to be this relationship between social space and infrastructure that has actually occurred in so many different examples. A very sort of typical example that's also quite relevant here is this is Park City in Utah. It used to be a mining town for silver mines, and as the mines ran out of silver, the lifts, this is like the Coalition building or the Silver King, where the lifts of silver came down from the mountain. What basically happened was that they repurposed the lifts and made them into ski lifts, bringing people up to the mountain to ski. So that when there was no more silver, leisure came and took over and actually inherited a lot of the existing infrastructure. This was like the landmark of Park City when it was a mining town. Then it burned down in the 80s and disappeared. But essentially the plumes of smoke of Park City, the mining town, has now turned into like snow cannons because it's really a ski resort, and it's, for a lot of you might know it because of the Sundance Film Festival, it's really become this sort of mecca for independent cinema in North America. Another example is the Kimball Art Museum in Park City is actually a former garage and gas station that has turned into this art museum today. It's located right in the middle of town, where you have people arriving from Deer Valley Drive, the main highway, and the main street where they cross each other. So it really has become like this sort of pivoting point. And we got invited by the Kimball Art Museum to look at expanding the museum significantly, to have a learning center and a whole new exhibition building. And we thought, like, instead of like spending all the money trying to, you know, if any of you have ever done a refurbishment, it's almost like opening this Pandora's box of potential misery, that as soon as you start hammering on anything, there's like trouble behind it. So we thought, like, let's not touch the existing building. We have it as this raw learning center. And then we consolidate all of the new program into a building that necessarily, because it has a smaller footprint, becomes taller than the neighbors. It's essentially a sandwich of the galleries, a media gallery at the bottom that's like nested into the sloping site, and then a sort of daylit gallery at the top that is turned to greet people arriving from out of town, almost like a friendly building that turns its head to sort of greet visitors. It has exactly the same proportions as the Coalition building, so we really like this idea that in a way sort of re-invoking the ghost of the Coalition building, the landmark of Park City, the cultural city, sort of is almost like the landmark of Park City, the industrial town. And how do you integrate something into this context that is like from like sort of built by woodchucks and miners? A lot of the immigrants were actually Scandinavian, and they brought with them the log cabin construction of overlogging or like interlocking logs. They used them to build the mine shafts.